A 12-year-old girl's tears fell onto cracked pavement like broken promises. Sophie's designer dress, now torn and stained, told a story of escape from golden cages and billion-dollar expectations. In the corner of Murphy's diner, she clutched her empty stomach while the world rushed past, blind to her silent desperation. Rachel, balancing plates and dreams on minimum wage, noticed what others couldn't see: a child drowning in plain sight. "Just Take My Leftovers" became the title of a moment that would shatter everything they thought they knew about worth, family, and the price of running from love. One act of kindness was about to expose the devastating truth behind a missing heiress and transform two lives forever. Subscribe to witness how a simple gesture ignites an extraordinary revelation. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner buzzed with the same relentless rhythm as Rachel's exhausted heartbeat, casting harsh shadows across checkered linoleum that had witnessed 1,000 small tragedies. Steam rose from coffee cups like prayers ascending to a ceiling stained with years of grease and broken dreams, while the constant clatter of plates and silverware created a symphony of survival that only those who lived paycheck to paycheck could truly understand. Rachel's sneakers, worn thin from double shifts and dashed hopes, squeaked against the floor as she navigated between tables filled with truckers, night shift workers, and the forgotten souls who found solace in 24-hour diners. Her uniform, a faded blue dress that had seen better decades, clung to her tired frame like a second skin that carried the weight of every customer's story, every tip that meant the difference between making rent and sleeping in her car. The smell of bacon grease and desperation hung thick in the air, mixing with the distant sound of traffic that never stopped, never rested, never acknowledged the small battles fought within these walls. She had been working since dawn, her feet screaming protests that her bank account couldn't afford to hear, when she first noticed the small figure huddled in the corner booth. Sophie sat motionless in the shadows, her 12-year-old frame dwarfed by the cracked vinyl seat that had absorbed decades of whispered confessions and silent tears. Her dress, once pristine white with delicate lace trim that spoke of department stores Rachel could only dream of entering, now bore the evidence of her journey, mud stains like fingerprints of desperation, tears that had dried into salt maps across expensive fabric. Her dark hair, usually maintained by professional stylists who charged more per hour than Rachel made in a week, hung in tangled curtains around a face that held the kind of exhaustion that shouldn't exist in someone so young. The child's hands, small and trembling, clutched a torn piece of paper that looked like it might have once been important, though now it served only as a talisman against the overwhelming loneliness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fever. Her eyes, wide and dark as midnight pools, stared at nothing and everything, seeing a world that had suddenly become foreign and frightening. The booth around her felt like an island in an ocean of noise and movement, a sanctuary that offered no real protection from the storm raging inside her chest. Rachel's maternal instincts, honed by years of caring for her younger siblings before life scattered them like leaves in autumn wind, recognized the particular quality of Sophie's stillness, the kind that came not from peace, but from a soul that had simply run out of ways to express its pain. The waitress had seen enough broken people pass through these doors to recognize the signs, the way Sophie's shoulders curved inward as if trying to disappear, the manner in which her breathing came in careful, controlled measures that suggested tears held back by sheer force of will. Every few minutes, the child would glance toward the door with a mixture of hope and terror, as if expecting someone to burst through and drag her back to whatever she had fled from, yet simultaneously praying for rescue from her current predicament. The contrast between her obvious wealth, evident in the quality of her ruined clothing, the expensive watch that caught the light on her thin wrist, and her current state of abandonment, created a cognitive dissonance that made Rachel's chest tighten. With protective fury, This was someone's daughter, someone's precious child, sitting alone in a diner at midnight with nowhere to go and no one to call. The injustice of it burned in Rachel's throat like swallowed fire, igniting something fierce and protective that she hadn't felt since her own childhood had been cut short by necessity. The dinner rush had long since faded into the lonely hours when only insomniacs and the desperate sought refuge in places like Murphy's, leaving Rachel with more time to observe the small tragedy unfolding in booth 7. Sophie hadn't ordered anything, hadn't even asked for water, but she sat with the patience of someone who had learned that asking for things often led to disappointment or worse. Her stomach had been growling for the past hour, a sound so soft and pitiful that it seemed to apologize for its own existence. Yet she made no move to approach the counter or signal for service. Rachel watched as the child's eyes followed each plate of food that passed by, not with the demanding hunger of a spoiled rich kid, but with the resigned longing of someone who had learned that wanting and receiving were two entirely different things. The way Sophie's hand occasionally drifted to her empty stomach, then quickly pulled away, as if ashamed of her body's basic needs, spoke of a conditioning that made Rachel's heart crack like ice in spring. This wasn't just about hunger. This was about a child who had been taught that her needs were inconvenient, that her presence was somehow a burden to be minimized. The realization hit Rachel like a physical blow, stealing her breath and filling her with a rage so pure and protective that it threatened to consume her entirely. As the clock above the register ticked past midnight, marking the transition from one day of struggle to another, Rachel found herself unable to focus on anything but the small figure who seemed to be shrinking with each passing moment. The child's breathing had become shallower, her already pale complexion taking on a greyish tinge that spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and emotional trauma combining into a perfect storm of physical distress. Sophie's eyelids fluttered with the effort of staying awake, but there was a vigilance in her posture that suggested sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Perhaps because she had learned that vulnerability invited danger, or perhaps because she was still hoping for someone to find her. The torn paper in her hands had been folded and refolded so many times that it was beginning to disintegrate, leaving small white fragments on the table like snow in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. Rachel could see the child's lips moving slightly, as if she were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, and the sight was so heartbreaking that the waitress had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to bridge the gap between their worlds and offer whatever comfort she could provide, even if it meant risking her job or stepping outside the boundaries of what was considered appropriate. The moment of decision arrived, like a whisper that grew into a roar, filling Rachel's consciousness with the absolute certainty that some things mattered more than rules, more than protocol, more than the fear of overstepping boundaries. Sophie's head had begun to droop with exhaustion, her small body finally succumbing to the weight of whatever had driven her to this place. And Rachel knew that she was witnessing something that would haunt her forever if she chose to remain a passive observer. The leftover sandwich from her own meager dinner break sat wrapped in paper behind the counter, turkey and cheese on day-old bread that represented half of her food budget for the week. But looking at this child, Rachel understood that some hungers transcended personal sacrifice. Her feet moved before her mind could catalogue all the reasons why this was complicated, why getting involved with customers' personal lives was discouraged, why a waitress making minimum wage couldn't afford to give away food or emotional energy. The distance between the counter and booth 7 felt like crossing an ocean, each step carrying her further from the safety of professional detachment and closer to a moment that would change everything she thought she knew about the power of simple human kindness. Subscribe to discover how one act of compassion will unveil a truth that shakes the foundations of everything both Rachel and Sophie believed about family, worth, and the courage it takes to truly see another person's pain. Rachel's approach to booth 7 felt like walking through water, each step weighted with the gravity of crossing invisible boundaries that separated the server from the served, the poor from the privileged, the adult from the child who had somehow fallen through every safety net that money was supposed to provide. Her worn sneakers whispered against the linoleum with a gentleness that seemed to understand the fragility of the moment, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The fluorescent light above Sophie's booth flickered intermittently, casting alternating shadows and harsh illumination across the child's face in a way that made her seem even more ethereal, more like a ghost of childhood than a living, breathing girl who needed help. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the wrapped sandwich, her own hunger forgotten in the face of something far more pressing than her empty stomach. The diner around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual cacophony of late-night sounds fading into a respectful hush, as if the universe itself recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Even the coffee machine stopped its perpetual gurgling, leaving only the soft sound of Sophie's labored breathing and the distant hum of traffic that carried other people to other destinations, other lives that would continue unchanged, while this moment rewrote the trajectory of two souls who had been strangers just minutes before. Sophie's eyes lifted as Rachel's shadow fell across the table, and the waitress felt her breath catch at the depth of pain she saw reflected in those dark depths, pain that belonged to someone decades older, pain that spoke of betrayals and disappointments that should never touch a 12-year-old's world. The child's face was a masterpiece of controlled emotion, every feature carefully arranged to project strength, while her eyes betrayed the terror and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. Her lips, chapped from crying and dehydration, parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but had forgotten how to form words that might be heard with kindness rather than judgment. The expensive watch on her wrist caught the light, its diamond-encrusted face a stark reminder of the world she had fled from, a world where time was money and love was often conditional on performance, compliance, and the ability to be the perfect daughter to a father who measured worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. Rachel could see the internal war playing out across Sophie's features, the desperate need for help battling against the learned behavior of self-reliance, the hunger for connection fighting with the fear of rejection that had clearly been her constant companion. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, fragile and precious and requiring the kind of courage that had nothing to do with money or status and everything to do with the willingness to be vulnerable in the presence of another human being's pain. "Hey there, sweetheart." Rachel's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, soft as cotton and warm as the embrace Sophie had been craving without knowing how to ask for it. The endearment hung in the air between them like a lifeline, thrown to someone drowning in an ocean of loneliness, and Rachel watched as Sophie's carefully constructed mask began to crack around the edges. The child's lower lip trembled with the effort of maintaining control, while her hands gripped the torn paper so tightly that her knuckles went white against her pale skin. Rachel lowered herself into the booth across from Sophie, with the careful grace of someone approaching a wounded animal, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, her entire being focused on creating a space where this broken child might feel safe enough to accept help. The vinyl seat creaked softly under her weight, a sound that seemed to echo in the vast emptiness that surrounded Sophie's heart, and Rachel found herself holding her breath as she waited to see whether her presence would be welcomed or feared. The sandwich in her hands felt heavier than it should, weighted with the significance of what it represented. Not just food, but acknowledgement, not just sustenance, but the radical act of seeing someone who had been rendered invisible by their own desperation. The fluorescent light continued its erratic dance above them, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the uncertain beating of two hearts, learning to trust in the possibility of unexpected kindness. "I noticed you've been sitting here for a while," Rachel continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to read the unspoken needs of others through years of serving coffee and comfort in equal measure. She placed the wrapped sandwich on the table between them, with the reverence of someone making an offering at an altar, her fingers lingering on the paper as if transferring some of her own warmth and hope into the simple meal. Sophie's eyes fixed on the sandwich with an intensity that spoke of hunger so deep it had become a physical ache, but she made no move to reach for it, her conditioning still stronger than her need. The child's breathing had become more shallow, more rapid, as if the proximity of food and kindness had awakened her body's awareness of just how depleted she had become. Rachel could see the internal struggle playing out in real time, the desperate want warring with the ingrained belief that accepting help meant admitting weakness, that needing something from a stranger was somehow shameful. The waitress recognized this battle because she had fought it herself countless times, in food banks and charity lines, in moments when pride and hunger collided with devastating force. But she also understood that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was the opportunity to be helped without judgment, to be seen as worthy of care simply because they existed, because they were human, because their pain mattered to someone else in the world. "I was about to throw this away," Rachel lied, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that sometimes kindness required deception, that sometimes the truth of charity needed to be wrapped in the fiction of convenience to be palatable to those too proud or too broken to accept direct help. Her words were carefully chosen to preserve Sophie's dignity while offering sustenance, to create a narrative where accepting the sandwich wasn't about pity, but about preventing waste. The child's eyes darted between Rachel's face and the offered food, searching for signs of mockery or hidden agendas, her young mind already trained to look for the catch that usually accompanied adult generosity. But Rachel's expression held nothing but genuine concern and the kind of maternal warmth that transcended biological connections. The universal language of one woman recognizing another's child in distress and responding with the fierce protectiveness that defined the best of human nature. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of a decision that would either build a bridge between their worlds or reinforce the walls that kept them separate. Rachel waited with the patience of someone who understood that trust was not given, but earned, that healing happened not in grand gestures, but in small moments of consistent kindness that proved the world still contained people who cared about strangers' suffering. The diner around them continued its late-night rhythm, but their booth had become a sacred space where two souls prepared to take the first tentative steps toward connection. Sophie's hand moved toward the sandwich with the hesitant grace of a bird approaching an uncertain perch, her fingers trembling with a combination of hunger, exhaustion, and the overwhelming relief of finally encountering someone who saw her not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a child who needed care. The moment her fingertips touched the paper wrapping, Rachel saw something shift in the girl's expression, a crack in the armor that had been protecting her from further disappointment, a glimpse of the vulnerable child beneath the premature sophistication that trauma had forced upon her. Tears began to well in Sophie's eyes, not the bitter tears of despair she had been shedding earlier, but the cleansing tears of someone who had forgotten that kindness still existed in the world and was overwhelmed by its unexpected appearance. The sandwich unwrapped with a soft, rustling sound that seemed to echo through the empty spaces in both their hearts, revealing simple food that had been transformed into something sacred by the context of its giving. Rachel watched as Sophie took her first bite with the reverence of someone receiving communion, her eyes closing as if to better savor not just the taste, but the feeling of being cared for by a stranger who owed her nothing but chose to give anyway. The sight of this small act of nourishment filled Rachel with a warmth that had nothing to do with the diner's heating system and everything to do with the recognition that she had just participated in something larger than herself, something that connected her to the long chain of human beings who had chosen compassion over indifference throughout history. Subscribe to witness how this simple act of sharing food becomes the catalyst for revelations that will transform both their lives and expose the shocking truth about Sophie's identity that will shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about family, wealth, and the true meaning of home. The sandwich disappeared with a speed that spoke of days without proper meals, Sophie's small hands working with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned not to take sustenance for granted, even when it came wrapped in kindness and served without conditions. Rachel watched with a mixture of satisfaction and growing concern as the child devoured every crumb, her hunger so profound that it seemed to consume not just the food, but the very air around them. Between bites, Sophie's eyes kept darting to Rachel's face, as if checking to ensure this wasn't some cruel dream that would evaporate the moment she allowed herself to believe in it fully. The waitress could see years of disappointment etched in those quick, fearful glances. The learned behavior of someone who had been promised care only to have it withdrawn when she needed it most. Her expensive clothing, now wrinkled and stained beyond recognition, told a story of privilege abandoned, or perhaps privilege that had never truly existed in any meaningful way. The designer label peeking from her collar seemed to mock the reality of her current situation, a reminder that money could buy beautiful things, but couldn't purchase the security of knowing someone would always be there to catch you when you fell. Rachel's heart ached with the recognition that this child had been failed by every system designed to protect her, that somehow all the wealth and status in the world hadn't been enough to keep her safe, fed, and loved. As Sophie finished the last bite, her composure finally cracked completely, and the tears that had been threatening all evening began to flow with the force of a dam finally giving way to overwhelming pressure. They weren't the quiet, controlled tears of someone trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, ugly sobs of a child who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance and could no longer pretend to be stronger than her years allowed. Her small body shook with the violence of emotions too large for her frame to contain, and Rachel felt her own eyes fill with sympathetic tears as she witnessed this complete breakdown of a soul that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will. The sound of Sophie's crying seemed to fill every corner of the diner, a primal expression of pain that cut through the ambient noise and demanded acknowledgement from anyone with a functioning heart. Rachel's maternal instincts overrode every professional boundary as she slid around to Sophie's side of the booth, gathering the trembling child into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear defending her cub. The embrace was awkward at first, Sophie's body rigid with the unfamiliarity of unconditional comfort, but gradually she melted into Rachel's warmth, her tears soaking into the waitress's uniform, as if trying to transfer some of her pain to someone strong enough to bear it. The feeling of holding this broken child filled Rachel with a purpose she hadn't experienced since her own siblings had grown up and moved away. A reminder of why human connection mattered more than any paycheck or career advancement. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Rachel whispered into Sophie's hair, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to coax truth from frightened children through patience rather than pressure. The question hung in the air like a bridge between anonymity and connection, offering Sophie the choice to remain a stranger or take the first step toward trust. For a long moment, the only response was the continued sound of muffled sobs against Rachel's shoulder, but gradually the crying began to subside into hiccuping breaths that spoke of exhaustion, finally overtaking fear. When Sophie finally pulled back enough to meet Rachel's eyes, her face was blotchy and swollen from crying. But there was something clearer in her expression, as if the tears had washed away some of the protective barriers that had been keeping her isolated. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to cost her tremendous effort to produce. "Sophie," she managed, the single word carrying the weight of someone who hadn't spoken her own name aloud in days. Someone who had begun to wonder if she still existed in any meaningful way. The simplicity of the introduction belied the complexity of what it represented. A child choosing to be known, to be seen, to trust a stranger with the most basic fact of her identity. Rachel felt the significance of this moment settle into her bones, understanding that she had just been given a gift more precious than any tip or recognition. The trust of someone who had every reason to believe that adults couldn't be counted on to care. "Sophie," Rachel repeated, testing the name on her tongue like a prayer, investing it with all the warmth and acceptance she could muster. "That's a beautiful name for a beautiful girl." The words seemed to surprise Sophie, as if she hadn't heard herself described in positive terms for so long that she'd forgotten such descriptions were possible. A ghost of a smile flickered across her tear-stained features before disappearing again. But Rachel caught it and held on to it like evidence that healing was possible, that beneath all the pain and fear was still a child capable of joy. The waitress found herself studying Sophie's face more carefully, now that she had a name to attach to the features, noting the aristocratic bone structure that spoke of generations of privilege, the quality of her dental work that suggested the best orthodontic care money could buy, the subtle signs of a life lived in luxury, even as she sat abandoned in a 24-hour diner. But more than the markers of wealth, Rachel saw the intelligence in Sophie's eyes, the quick way she processed information and calculated risks, the premature wisdom that came from navigating adult complexities before her emotional development could catch up. This wasn't just any runaway child. This was someone whose absence would be noticed, whose disappearance would create ripples in circles far removed from the working-class world of Murphy's diner. The realization sent a chill down Rachel's spine as she began to understand that helping Sophie might involve complications she hadn't anticipated, consequences that could extend far beyond a simple act of kindness between strangers. "Sophie, honey, where are your parents?" The question emerged with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that sometimes the most important conversations required careful navigation through emotional minefields. Rachel felt Sophie's body tense against her at the mention of parents, a physical reaction so immediate and pronounced that it answered the question before any words could be spoken. The child's breathing became shallow again, her eyes taking on the hunted look of someone who had learned to associate the concept of family with pain rather than protection. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a bitterness that no 12-year-old should possess, a cynicism born from experiences that had taught her that the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally were often the ones who hurt her most deeply. "My father," she began, then stopped, her throat working as if the words were physically painful to produce. "My father doesn't want me anymore. He said I was too much trouble, that I was ruining everything he worked for." The deed and the confession hung between them, like a wound exposed to air, raw and bleeding, and requiring the kind of careful tending that Rachel instinctively knew how to provide. The waitress felt her heart shatter at the casual way Sophie delivered this devastating information, as if she had already accepted it as truth, rather than recognizing it as the cruel lie of an adult who had failed in the most fundamental way possible. The pieces of a larger puzzle began to arrange themselves in Rachel's mind. A wealthy father, a runaway daughter, expensive clothes on a child sitting alone in a diner. But the picture they formed was so shocking that she almost couldn't allow herself to believe it. The implications of Sophie's words settled over Rachel like a heavy blanket, suffocating in their enormity and demanding a response that went far beyond the simple kindness she had initially offered. This wasn't just about a hungry child or even a runaway. This was about a system that had failed so completely that a father could abandon his own daughter, could convince her that her existence was a burden rather than a blessing. Rachel's hands tightened protectively around Sophie's small frame as she processed the magnitude of what she was hearing, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences, while her heart simply ached for the profound loneliness this child must have endured. The diner around them continued its late-night rhythm, oblivious to the earth-shattering revelations being shared in Booth 7, but Rachel felt as if the entire world had shifted on its axis, as if everything she thought she knew about family and responsibility had been called into question by the simple honesty of a broken child. Sophie's breathing had steadied somewhat, but Rachel could feel the tension in her small body, the way she held herself ready to flee if this new source of comfort proved as unreliable as all the others had been. The weight of responsibility settled onto Rachel's shoulders, like a mantle she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse, understanding that whatever happened next would define not just Sophie's immediate future, but potentially the trajectory of both their lives. Subscribe to discover the shocking moment when Sophie's true identity is revealed, and Rachel realizes she's been comforting not just any runaway child, but the missing heiress whose disappearance has triggered a citywide search that will bring powerful forces crashing into their quiet sanctuary. The television mounted in the corner of Murphy's diner had been playing the late-night news on mute for hours, its flickering images providing background ambience that most customers ignored in favor of their own private dramas and quiet desperation. But as Rachel held Sophie close, offering what comfort she could to a child whose pain seemed bottomless, the screen suddenly filled with an image that made her blood freeze in her veins. A professional photograph of Sophie, younger and smiling, dressed in pristine white for what looked like a formal family portrait. The resemblance was unmistakable, despite the current state of the girl in her arms. The same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure, the same aristocratic features that now seemed almost surreal in the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the diner. Rachel's grip on Sophie tightened involuntarily as she read the scrolling text beneath the image, her mind struggling to process words that seemed to rearrange reality itself. Missing. Sophie Grant, 12. Daughter of billionaire CEO Marcus Grant. $50,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. The numbers swam before Rachel's eyes as the magnitude of the situation crashed over her like a tsunami, washing away every assumption she had made about this encounter and replacing them with a terror so profound it threatened to paralyze her completely. This wasn't just any runaway child. This was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose business empire touched every aspect of the economy and whose influence extended into political circles that could make or break ordinary people like Rachel without a second thought. Sophie felt the change in Rachel's body language immediately, the way the waitress's breathing became sharp and shallow, the sudden rigidity in her embrace that spoke of fear rather than comfort. The child pulled back to look at Rachel's face, following her gaze to the television screen where her own image stared back at them like an accusation. The color drained from Sophie's already pale features as she realized that her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered, that the sanctuary she had found in this humble diner was about to be invaded by the very forces she had been running from. "You know who I am now," she whispered, her voice carrying the flat resignation of someone who had learned that knowledge of her identity always changed how people treated her, usually for the worse. The tears that had finally stopped began to flow again, but these were different. Tears of betrayal and abandonment, tears that spoke of a child who had dared to hope that someone might care about her for herself rather than for what she represented. Rachel watched in horror as Sophie began to withdraw into herself again, the fragile trust they had built over the past hour crumbling like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. The girl's small hands began to shake as she prepared to flee, her survival instincts kicking in with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that running was often the only option when adults discovered her true worth in dollars rather than humanity. "Sophie, wait!" Rachel's voice cracked with desperation as she reached for the child who was already sliding toward the edge of the booth, preparing to disappear back into the night from which she had emerged. The waitress felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that her knowledge of Sophie's identity might be the very thing that drove her away, that the revelation of wealth and status might destroy the simple human connection they had forged over a shared sandwich and honest tears. "Please don't run," she pleaded, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to prevent another abandonment in this child's already traumatic young life. "I don't care who your father is or how much money he has. I care about you, Sophie, the girl who's been sitting in my diner crying and hungry and alone." The sincerity in Rachel's voice seemed to penetrate Sophie's defensive walls, causing her to pause in her escape attempt, though her body remained coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of betrayal. The television continued its silent broadcast, cycling through images of search parties and press conferences, of a father who looked appropriately concerned for the cameras, but whose eyes held a coldness that made Rachel's skin crawl. She began to understand why Sophie had run, why a child with every material advantage had chosen the uncertainty of the streets over the supposed security of her father's mansion. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. A powerful man, more concerned with his public image than his daughter's well-being. A child who had been treated as a liability rather than a blessing. A family dynamic so toxic that running away seemed like the only path to survival. "He doesn't want me back because he loves me," Sophie's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind of devastating truth that only children could speak with such clarity. "He wants me back because I'm bad for business, because having a missing daughter makes him look like he can't control his own family, and that makes investors nervous." The sophistication of her analysis was heartbreaking, revealing a child who had been forced to understand adult motivations and corporate politics when she should have been worried about homework and playground friendships. Rachel felt her heart break completely as she realized the full scope of Sophie's isolation, not just physically abandoned, but emotionally neglected by a father who saw her as a public relations problem rather than a human being deserving of love and protection. The $50,000 reward suddenly took on a sinister cast, not as evidence of a father's desperate love, but as a business expense. A cost-effective way to resolve a situation that was damaging his carefully cultivated image. The television screen showed footage of Marcus Grant at a press conference, his expensive suit and practiced expressions of concern creating a performance that Sophie had clearly learned to see through with devastating accuracy. Rachel understood now why the child had been so hesitant to trust, why she had expected kindness to come with conditions and strings attached, because in her world everything did, including parental love. The weight of responsibility that had been building on Rachel's shoulders throughout the evening suddenly crystallized into something approaching terror as she realized the full implications of her situation. She was a minimum wage waitress who had just discovered she was harboring the runaway daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose resources could destroy her life with a single phone call if he chose to view her as an obstacle rather than a helper. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should call the number on the screen immediately, collect the reward money that represented more than she made in a year, and return to the safety of anonymity and financial security. But looking at Sophie's tear-stained face, seeing the terror in those dark eyes at the thought of being dragged back to a home that had never truly been a sanctuary, Rachel felt something fierce and protective rise within her that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the fundamental human obligation to protect children from harm. The television continued its cycle of images and information, but Rachel found herself turning away from it, focusing instead on the real child in front of her rather than the media narrative that reduced Sophie to a missing person case and a dollar amount. The diner around them felt smaller now, more fragile, as if the walls that had provided sanctuary were no match for the forces that would soon come looking for the billionaire's daughter. But in this moment, in the space between revelation and consequence, Rachel made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She chose the child over the reward, the human over the headline, the right thing over the easy thing. "Sophie," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't care about any reward money, and I don't care about your father's business empire. What I care about is making sure you're safe and that you know you have someone in this world who sees you as more than just a problem to be solved." The words seemed to surprise Sophie, who had clearly expected betrayal or abandonment now that her true identity was known. Rachel watched as hope and disbelief warred across the child's features, her young mind struggling to process the possibility that someone might choose her well-being over financial gain. The waitress reached across the table and took Sophie's small hands in her own, feeling the trembling that spoke of a nervous system pushed far beyond its limits by stress and trauma. "But we need to figure out what to do next, because staying here isn't safe for either of us now. Your father's people will be looking everywhere, and when they find you, they're going to want to know who helped you and why." The reality of their situation settled between them like a third presence at the table, demanding acknowledgement and planning rather than just emotional support. Rachel's mind raced through possibilities and consequences, trying to find a path forward that would protect Sophie while not destroying her own life in the process. The television screen flickered with more images of the search, of police officers and private security teams, of a manhunt that was closing in on their small sanctuary with the inexorable force of money and power. Subscribe to witness the heart-stopping moment when Rachel must make an impossible choice between her own safety and protecting a child who has nowhere else to turn. As the forces hunting for Sophie close in on their hiding place and threaten to tear apart the fragile bond they've built in the space of a single night. The first pale threads of morning light crept through the diner's windows like unwelcome witnesses, casting long shadows across the empty booths where dreams had been shared and secrets whispered in the darkness. Rachel felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones, but beneath it pulsed something far more dangerous, a fierce protectiveness that had taken root in her heart during the long hours of the night. Sophie stirred against her shoulder, small fingers still clutching the fabric of Rachel's uniform as if it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting away into the void of her fractured childhood. The silence between them had become sacred, a temple built from understanding and the kind of trust that blooms only in the soil of genuine compassion. Outside, the city was beginning to stir with the mechanical rhythm of another day, but inside this sanctuary of fluorescent light and worn vinyl, time seemed suspended in amber. Rachel knew that with each passing moment, the distance between Sophie and her father's searching eyes was shrinking, yet she couldn't bring herself to break the spell that had transformed them both from strangers into something resembling family. The soft chime of the diner's bell shattered their fragile peace like glass against stone, and Rachel's heart lurched as she recognized the purposeful stride of expensive shoes against linoleum. "Mr. Grant stood in the doorway, his imposing figure backlit by the growing dawn, and for a moment he seemed less like a father and more like a force of nature, inevitable, overwhelming, and utterly beyond the control of mere mortals. His eyes swept the empty diner with the precision of a man accustomed to finding what he sought, and when his gaze finally settled on the small form curled against Rachel's side, something shifted in his expression that was too complex to name. Sophie's body went rigid at the sound of his voice calling her name, a single word that carried the weight of 12 years of expectation and disappointment, of love expressed through control and care, measured in dollar signs rather than presence. Rachel felt the girl's terror like a physical thing, a trembling that started in her core and radiated outward until even the air around them seemed to vibrate with fear. The distance between the door and their booth stretched like an ocean, but Mr. Grant crossed it with the inexorable patience of a man who had never learned to doubt his own authority. Rachel's hand found Sophie's and squeezed gently, a silent promise that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Sophie. The name fell from Mr. Grant's lips like a prayer and a condemnation rolled into one, heavy with the accumulated weight of a night spent in terror and self-recrimination. His eyes, when they finally met Rachel's across the narrow table, held depths she hadn't expected, not just the cold calculation of wealth and power, but something raw and vulnerable that spoke of a father's love filtered through the lens of a man who had forgotten how to express tenderness without conditions. Rachel felt herself caught between two gravitational pulls, the protective instinct that urged her to shield Sophie from whatever storm was about to break, and the growing recognition that this man's pain was as real and devastating as his daughter's, even if it wore the mask of authority and control. Sophie's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the kind of panic that comes not from immediate danger, but from the crushing weight of inevitability, the knowledge that the brief respite of freedom was about to end. Mr. Grant's approach was measured, deliberate, each step calculated to avoid sudden movements that might send his daughter fleeing once again into the labyrinth of the city's indifferent streets. Rachel could see the effort it cost him, this careful choreography of approach and restraint, and she began to understand that perhaps the distance between father and daughter had been built not from lack of love, but from the tragic inability to bridge the gap between protection and suffocation. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the tears that Sophie had been holding back, transforming them into diamonds of sorrow that broke Rachel's heart all over again. When Mr. Grant finally reached their booth, he didn't immediately reach for his daughter or demand explanations with the voice of absolute authority that Rachel had expected. Instead, he slid into the opposite seat with a weariness that seemed to age him decades in the span of a heartbeat, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled from a night of searching and worry. His eyes never left Sophie's face, drinking in the sight of her as if he were a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. And Rachel realized with a start that whatever else this man might be, CEO, billionaire, master of his corporate universe, in this moment he was simply a father who had come terrifyingly close to losing the most precious thing in his world. Sophie's grip on Rachel's hand tightened until her small fingers left marks, but she didn't pull away or attempt to flee, as if some part of her recognized that the time for running had passed. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that none of them quite knew how to cross, heavy with unspoken apologies and the weight of love that had somehow lost its way in the maze of expectations and responsibilities. Mr. Grant's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, stripped of all the commanding presence that had built his empire and reduced to the simple, devastating honesty of a man confronting his own failures. "I've been looking for you all night," he said, and in those 6 words, Rachel heard the echo of every parent's worst nightmare, the terror that lurks beneath the surface of every goodbye. Every moment when a child steps out of sight and into the vast uncertainty of a world that doesn't always keep its promises. The confession that spilled from Mr. Grant's lips came in fragments, pieces of a story that had been buried beneath years of corporate success and the relentless pursuit of security through control. He spoke of Sophie's mother, lost to cancer when Sophie was barely old enough to understand that some people leave and never come back, and how his response to that devastating loss had been to build walls of protection so high and so thick that they had become a prison for them both. Rachel listened with growing understanding as he described the tutors and bodyguards, the carefully controlled environment that he had convinced himself was love, but that Sophie had experienced a suffocation, a golden cage that glittered with privilege but offered no room for the messy, unpredictable business of actually growing up. His voice cracked when he admitted that he had been so focused on keeping Sophie safe from the world that he had forgotten to keep her safe from the loneliness that had been eating away at her spirit like acid, leaving her hollow and desperate for any connection that felt real and unguarded. Sophie's tears fell freely now, not the bitter tears of anger and rebellion that had driven her into the night, but the cleansing rain of grief, finally acknowledged and shared. Rachel felt her own eyes burning as she witnessed this moment of raw honesty, this stripping away of pretense and power to reveal the fundamental truth that love, no matter how well-intentioned, can become its own form of cruelty when it forgets to include trust and freedom in its equation. The morning light had grown stronger, painting the diner in shades of gold and amber that seemed to bless this moment of reckoning, this painful but necessary excavation of the buried foundations of their relationship. As father and daughter finally looked directly at each other across the scarred surface of the diner table, Rachel felt something shift in the air around them, a subtle but unmistakable change in the emotional weather that suggested the possibility of healing. Mr. Grant's hand moved slowly across the table, palm up in a gesture of offering rather than demand, and after a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Sophie's small fingers crept forward to meet his. The contact was electric, charged with all the love and pain and hope that had been building between them through the long night of separation and fear, and Rachel had to look away from the intensity of it, feeling like an intruder in this moment of profound reconnection. But when Sophie's other hand remained firmly clasped in hers, she understood that she had become more than just a witness to this family's crisis. She had become a bridge, a catalyst that had somehow made this moment of truth possible. Mr. Grant's eyes met hers over their joined hands, and in them she saw not the gratitude of a wealthy man toward someone who had provided a service, but the recognition of one human being toward another who had offered something far more valuable than money could buy. The simple, revolutionary act of seeing a child's pain and responding with unconditional kindness. The future stretched before them, uncertain and complex, but for the first time since Sophie had stumbled into her life, Rachel felt the stirring of hope that perhaps some stories, even the most broken ones, could find their way to something resembling a happy ending. The conversation that followed moved like a careful dance around the jagged edges of hurt and misunderstanding, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon working to repair damage that had been years in the making. Mr. Grant spoke of board meetings that had stretched past Sophie's bedtime, of business trips that had taken him away during school plays and birthday parties, of the crushing weight of responsibility that had convinced him that providing financial security was the same thing as providing love. Rachel watched Sophie's face as her father laid bare the architecture of his failures, seeing the war between forgiveness and resentment playing out in the girl's dark eyes like storm clouds, gathering and dispersing in an uncertain sky. The diner around them had begun to fill with the early morning crowd, construction workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, nurses heading home after long nights, the ordinary people whose lives formed the backdrop against which this extraordinary reconciliation was taking place. Rachel felt the surreal quality of the moment, the way that life-changing events often unfold in the most mundane settings, as if the universe delights in the contrast between the magnitude of human emotion and the simple spaces where it chooses to reveal itself. Sophie's voice, when she finally spoke, was small but steady, carrying the weight of a wisdom that no 12-year-old should have to possess, yet somehow managing to bridge the gap between childhood innocence and the hard-earned understanding that comes from surviving disappointment. The words that tumbled from Sophie's lips were a mixture of accusation and longing, a child's attempt to articulate the complex emotions that had driven her into the night and into Rachel's protective embrace. She spoke of feeling like a beautiful object in her father's collection, rather than a living, breathing daughter with thoughts and dreams and fears that deserved to be heard and honored. Rachel felt her heart breaking all over again, as Sophie described the loneliness of a house filled with every luxury except the one thing she craved most: the simple presence of a parent who saw her as more than a responsibility to be managed or a legacy to be protected. Mr. Grant's face crumpled with each revelation, the careful mask of corporate composure finally giving way to the raw grief of a man confronting the unintended consequences of his choices. The morning light streaming through the diner windows seemed to illuminate every line of pain etched into his features, transforming him from the imposing figure who had walked through the door into something far more human and vulnerable. Rachel found herself caught between her protective instincts toward Sophie and a growing empathy for this man who had clearly loved his daughter deeply, but had somehow lost the ability to express that love in ways she could understand and accept. The silence that followed Sophie's words was heavy with the weight of recognition, the moment when both father and daughter began to see each other not as adversaries in a battle of wills, but as fellow travelers on a journey that had somehow led them astray from each other. Mr. Grant's response came slowly, each word carefully measured as if he were learning a new language. The language of vulnerability and honest emotion that had been foreign to him for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed. He spoke of his own childhood, raised by parents who had equated love with achievement and affection with accomplishment, and how he had unconsciously replicated those patterns with Sophie, despite his conscious desire to give her everything he had never had. Rachel listened with growing understanding as he described the terror that had gripped him after his wife's death, the paralyzing fear that if he didn't control every aspect of Sophie's environment, he might lose her too, and how that fear had gradually transformed love into a kind of benevolent tyranny that had driven away the very person he was trying to protect. Sophie's grip on Rachel's hand had loosened slightly, but she didn't let go entirely, as if she needed that anchor of unconditional support to navigate the treacherous waters of forgiveness and reconciliation. The diner's morning rush swirled around them like a river flowing past an island, the ordinary business of life continuing while this small family worked to rebuild the foundations of their relationship from the ground up. Rachel felt the privilege and responsibility of witnessing this moment, understanding that she had somehow become a catalyst for a transformation that might never have happened without the strange alchemy of circumstances that had brought them all together in this place, at this time, under these extraordinary conditions. The breakthrough came not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in the quiet space between words where understanding finally found room to grow. Sophie's voice, when she spoke again, carried a note of tentative hope that made Rachel's heart soar, even as tears continued to stream down the girl's face. She spoke of wanting to know her father not as the CEO or the provider or the protector, but as the man who had loved her mother, who had chosen her name, who had once sung lullabies and told bedtime stories before the weight of responsibility had stolen away his capacity for simple joy. Mr. Grant's response was immediate and visceral, a promise that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul rather than the calculating mind that had built his empire. He spoke of changes he would make, not just in their living arrangements or his work schedule, but in the fundamental way he approached their relationship, recognizing that true protection came not from controlling every variable, but from teaching Sophie to navigate the world with confidence and wisdom. Rachel felt the shift in the air around them, the way that hope, once kindled, begins to transform everything it touches, casting familiar shadows in new and more forgiving light. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting the diner in warm gold that seemed to bless this moment of new beginning, this fragile but genuine attempt to build something better from the ruins of what had come before. As the conversation continued, Rachel began to understand that her role in this story was far from over, that the kindness she had shown to a crying child had somehow woven her into the fabric of this family's future, in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Mr. Grant's eyes kept returning to her face with an expression that was part gratitude, part curiosity, and part something deeper that she couldn't quite name, but that made her pulse quicken with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Sophie, too, seemed to sense that the bond forged between them in the darkness of the night was not something to be easily severed by the return of daylight and the restoration of family harmony. The girl's hand remained firmly clasped in hers, a silent declaration that some connections transcend the circumstances of their creation and become something permanent and precious. Rachel felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, not the burden of obligation, but the lighter, more joyful weight of being needed and wanted by people who had somehow become important to her in the space of a few short hours. The future stretched before them, uncertain and complex, but filled with the kind of potential that comes only when broken things find the courage to heal and grow stronger in the places where they were once fractured. The morning light continued to pour through the windows, transforming the humble diner into a cathedral of second chances and new beginnings. The conversation gradually shifted from the painful excavation of past mistakes to the more hopeful territory of future possibilities, and Rachel found herself drawn into discussions about Sophie's education, her interests, her dreams for a life that might finally include both security and freedom. Mr. Grant spoke with growing animation about changes he wanted to make, not just in their daily routine, but in the fundamental structure of their relationship, creating space for Sophie to be a child while still honoring her intelligence and maturity. Sophie's responses grew more animated as well, the spark of life that had been dimmed by loneliness beginning to flicker back to brightness as she realized that her voice was not only being heard, but actively sought and valued. Rachel felt herself becoming more than just a witness to this reconciliation. She was becoming a participant, her insights and observations welcomed by both father and daughter as they worked to build new patterns of communication and connection. The morning crowd in the diner provided a gentle backdrop of normalcy, reminding them all that life would continue, that this moment of crisis and resolution was part of a larger story that was still being written. As the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, Rachel began to understand that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that the ripple effects of compassion can transform not just individual lives, but entire families, creating new possibilities that none of them could have imagined when the night began. The first pale threads of morning light crept through the diner's windows like unwelcome witnesses, casting long shadows across the empty booths where Rachel and Sophie had spent their fragile night together. The warmth they had built between them seemed to evaporate with each passing moment, replaced by the cold reality of what was coming. Rachel's hands trembled as she poured coffee she didn't want, her eyes constantly drifting to the small figure curled in the corner booth, still wrapped in her oversized jacket. The approaching footsteps outside grew louder, more deliberate, like the countdown to an execution neither of them was ready to face. Sophie stirred from her restless sleep, her eyes immediately finding Rachel's across the empty space. And in that moment of recognition, both understood that their borrowed time was running out. The child's face crumpled with the weight of impending separation, her small hands clutching the fabric of Rachel's jacket as if it could anchor her to this moment forever. Rachel moved toward her with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal, her heart breaking with each footfall that brought her closer to the goodbye she wasn't ready to say. The diner felt like a sanctuary about to be violated, their safe haven transformed into a stage for the final act of their brief but profound connection. The sound of expensive car doors slamming shut outside shattered the morning stillness like gunshots, each one driving deeper into Rachel's chest, the reality that Sophie would soon be torn from her arms. Through the window, she could see the silhouettes of men in dark suits, their movements precise and purposeful, like soldiers preparing for a carefully orchestrated retrieval mission. Sophie's breathing became shallow and rapid, her small body trembling against Rachel's side as the weight of her father's approaching presence pressed down on them both. The diner's familiar warmth turned cold and hostile, every surface reflecting back the harsh truth that love alone couldn't protect them from the forces gathering outside. Rachel knelt beside the booth, her hands cupping Sophie's tear-stained face with a tenderness that spoke of promises she couldn't keep and protection she couldn't offer. The child's eyes searched hers desperately, looking for some miracle, some escape route that would allow them to remain in this bubble of safety they had created together. But Rachel could only offer the truth of her love, the certainty that this night had changed them both forever, even as the world prepared to tear them apart. The approaching footsteps grew closer, more insistent, like the heartbeat of an inevitable fate that neither of them had the power to resist. The diner door's bell chimed with a finality that seemed to echo through both their souls, announcing the end of their stolen time and the beginning of a separation that would leave scars on both their hearts. Rachel pulled Sophie closer, memorizing the weight of her small body, the scent of her hair, the way her breath felt against her neck in these final moments of their fragile sanctuary. Outside, the world waited with its demands and expectations, ready to reclaim what it considered its own, but inside this moment they belonged only to each other. The morning light grew stronger, more insistent, washing away the protective darkness that had sheltered their connection and exposing them to the harsh reality of their different worlds. Mr. Grant stepped through the diner's entrance like a force of nature contained in an expensive suit, his presence immediately transforming the humble space into something that felt too small, too ordinary to contain the magnitude of his relief and rage. His eyes swept the room with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling every variable, until they landed on the impossible sight of his daughter, wrapped in a stranger's arms, safe, but forever changed by her night away from his world. The air itself seemed to shift around him, charged with the electricity of a father's desperate love and the cold authority of a man who had built an empire on the foundation of his will alone. Rachel felt the temperature in the room drop as she met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same fierce protectiveness she had felt for Sophie, but magnified by years of power and the terror of almost losing everything that mattered. She stood slowly, her hands still resting on Sophie's shoulders, unwilling to break their connection even as she faced the man who had every right to tear them apart. The silence stretched between them, like a chasm filled with unspoken accusations and desperate explanations, each second heavy with the weight of judgment and the fragile hope for understanding. Sophie's voice broke the tension like a stone thrown through glass, her small daddy carrying years of complicated love and fresh rebellion, the word both a surrender and a defiance that left all three of them suspended in the space between reunion and reckoning. Mr. Grant's composure cracked for just a moment, his carefully controlled facade revealing the raw terror of a father who had spent the night imagining every possible tragedy that could befall his child. Rachel watched the transformation, seeing not the intimidating CEO, but a man whose world had been shattered by the simple act of his daughter walking away from everything he had built to protect her. The businessman's eyes moved from his daughter to Rachel, studying the young woman who had become Sophie's sanctuary, his analytical mind trying to process how a stranger had succeeded where his army of security and caregivers had failed. There was something in his gaze that went beyond gratitude or suspicion, a recognition of the bond that had formed between his daughter and this waitress, a connection that threatened to complicate the neat boundaries of his carefully ordered world. Rachel stood her ground, her chin lifted with a dignity that surprised them both, refusing to be diminished by his wealth or intimidated by his power. The moment stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of decisions that would reshape all their lives. As Mr. Grant struggled between his instinct to reclaim his daughter and his growing understanding that something profound had happened in this humble diner that money couldn't buy or control. Sophie remained pressed against Rachel's side, her small body a bridge between two worlds that had never been meant to touch. Her presence, a living testament to the power of human connection to transcend the barriers of class and circumstance. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the three of them like actors on a stage, frozen in a tableau that would determine whether love could truly conquer the vast distances between their different worlds. The silence that followed stretched like a tightrope between them, each breath carefully measured as Mr. Grant processed the impossible scene before him. His runaway heiress daughter clinging to a waitress who had shown her more genuine care in one night than most people experienced in a lifetime. His trained eye took in every detail, the way Sophie's small fingers gripped Rachel's uniform, the protective stance of the young woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, the transformation in his daughter's face that spoke of healing he hadn't known she needed. The businessman in him calculated risks and benefits, but the father in him recognized something that defied all his careful equations. Rachel felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical force, but she refused to step away from Sophie, her body forming a shield between the child and a world that had already proven it could wound her. She had spent the night learning the language of Sophie's pain, understanding the loneliness that lived behind designer clothes and private tutors, and she wouldn't abandon that knowledge now just because its source wore a suit that cost more than her yearly salary. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the quiet strength of someone who had found her purpose in the most unexpected place. Her words carefully chosen but unflinchingly honest. She needed someone to see her, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Not the heiress, not the CEO's daughter, just Sophie. The simple truth hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to find, connecting two worlds that operated by completely different rules, but shared the same fundamental need for genuine human connection. Mr. Grant's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the armor of his professional persona developing hairline cracks that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the empire. Sophie's voice joined the conversation like a small but determined bell, her words carrying the weight of a child who had learned to navigate between truth and expectation. Her explanation of the night painting a picture that left her father speechless with recognition of his own failures. She spoke of feeling invisible in her own home, of the loneliness that echoed through marble hallways, of the hunger for connection that no amount of money could satisfy, her honesty cutting through the comfortable lies they had all been living. Rachel listened with tears in her eyes, understanding finally the full magnitude of what had brought this child to her diner in the middle of the night. The businessman found himself facing a choice that couldn't be solved with contracts or negotiations, a decision that would require him to acknowledge that his daughter's greatest need was something his wealth couldn't provide, but this stranger had offered freely. He looked at Rachel with new eyes, seeing not a threat to his control, but a bridge to his daughter's heart, a connection that could heal wounds he hadn't even known existed. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the three of them as they stood at the crossroads between the world as it was and the world as it could be, their future hanging in the balance of a father's willingness to let love reshape the boundaries of his carefully constructed empire.